You learned early how to disappear without leaving the room, not physically, emotionally. You learned how to sense the mood before speaking, how to swallow needs before they became inconvenient, how to read silence the way other children read bedtime stories. You became skilled at not asking, skilled at not wanting, skilled at not needing, and no one ever sat you down and told you this was happening. That's the quiet cruelty of emotional neglect. There was no obvious violence, no single catastrophic memory you can point to and say, that's where it broke. Instead, there was absence, a missing warmth, a consistent lack of emotional response when you reached out or stopped reaching out. So you adapted. You became independent too early, self-contained, low maintenance. You told yourself, I'm fine. And eventually, you believed it. Here is the paradox that defines your life now. The coping strategy that saved you as a child is the same strategy that sabotages your intimacy as an adult. What once kept you safe now keeps you alone. Because when you learned that your emotions weren't mirrored, welcomed, or held, you didn't just stop expressing them. You stopped trusting that anyone could handle them. You learned to regulate yourself in isolation, to be your own witness, your own comfort, your own container. And on the outside, this looks like strength. But on the inside, it feels like an invisible exile. You don't feel dramatic enough to be traumatized. You don't feel broken enough to ask for help. You don't feel safe enough to fully rest into connection. You survive by being emotionally self-sufficient and quietly starve for closeness at the same time. This is the psychology of a child who was emotionally neglected. Emotional neglect is not about what happened to you. It's about what didn't happen. No one noticed when you were overwhelmed. No one guided you through big emotions. No one consistently reflected your inner world back to you and said, I see you. That makes sense. From a developmental perspective, this absence has profound consequences. One of the core concepts here is attachment theory, particularly avoidant attachment. When caregivers are emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or dismissive, a child's nervous system learns a brutal lesson. Connection is unreliable. Expression is unsafe. Dependence leads to disappointment. So the child adapts by minimizing needs, not because they don't have them, but because they learned that having them leads nowhere. Another key concept is parentification. Even in subtle forms, emotionally neglected children often become internally responsible for themselves, or even for their caregivers' emotional states. You learn to self-soothe before your nervous system is mature enough to do so. You grow up too early, not because you want to, but because there is no one else. Neurologically, this creates chronic self-monitoring. The brain's default mode network, the system responsible for self-referential thought, becomes hyperactive. You think about yourself constantly, not out of narcissism, but out of vigilance. Am I okay? Am I too much? Am I allowed to feel this? This is often paired with emotional alexithymia, difficulty identifying and naming emotions, because no one helped you learn the language of feeling. Emotions were experienced alone, without translation. Imagine growing up in a house with no mirrors. You exist, you move, you react, but you never see yourself reflected clearly. That's emotional neglect. The deepest cost of emotional neglect is not sadness, it is disconnection from authenticity. You learned to edit yourself before you were even conscious of doing it. You learned that belonging required shrinking, that love required being easy, that safety required silence. So you sacrificed something fundamental, not your intelligence, not your competence, not your resilience. You sacrificed your right to be witnessed in need. Carl Jung once said, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. But there is another burden, the unlived life of the child themselves, the version of you who wanted comfort, who wanted reassurance without justification, who wanted to fall apart without consequence. That version learned to go quiet. And the grief of that loss is rarely acknowledged because it doesn't look like grief. It looks like capability, like emotional control, like maturity. But inside, there is a constant tension, a longing for closeness paired with a terror of dependence, a desire to be known paired with a reflex to withdraw, a hunger for softness paired with an inability to ask for it. The core fear driving this is not abandonment in the dramatic sense. It is the fear of being emotionally exposed and unmet. You don't fear vulnerability because it's weak. You fear it because you've already lived through the pain of offering yourself and finding no one there. So even joy becomes complicated. Rest feels undeserved. Receiving feels foreign. Love feels conditional, even when it isn't. This is the invisible grief of emotional neglect. You learned to live without asking and forgot how to receive without guilt. Emotional neglect does not disappear in adulthood. It becomes sophisticated. It wears new disguises. You might recognize it here. In relationships, you struggle to express needs until resentment builds. You tell yourself you're low maintenance, but secretly wish someone would notice without being told. In intimacy, you crave closeness, but feel suffocated once it arrives. You oscillate between longing and withdrawal, connection and shutdown. In your career, you overfunction. You tie worth to usefulness. Rest feels unsafe because productivity became your proof of value. In boundaries, you don't know where yours end and others begin. You accommodate reflexively, then feel invisible. Internally, you experience emotional numbness, punctuated by sudden waves of overwhelm. Feelings stay buried until they don't. In self-talk, you minimize your pain. You say, others had it worse, as if suffering must be earned through comparison. These are not personality traits. They are coping strategies. They were intelligent adaptations to an environment where emotional presence was inconsistent or absent. Healing begins not by fixing these traits, but by witnessing them without judgment, by noticing the pattern and saying, this makes sense. Not, what's wrong with me, but what did I learn to survive? This shift from self-gaslighting to self-observation is the beginning of unlearning. Healing emotional neglect is not dramatic. It is subtle, relational, repetitive. It begins with reparenting, not in a sentimental sense, but in a nervous system sense. You practice responding to yourself the way no one consistently did. You name feelings. You allow pauses. You validate without rushing to solutions. It involves inner child work, where you stop demanding adult-level resilience from the part of you that learned to survive too soon. It involves shadow work, where you reclaim needs you were taught to suppress: dependency, softness, longing. Most importantly, it involves choosing safe connection slowly, letting yourself be seen in increments, testing gently the belief that no one will show up. Because the goal is not to become less independent. The goal is to become interdependent, able to stand alone and lean without shame. As the psychologist Donald Winnicott wrote, it is a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found. You were hidden for a long time. Healing is allowing yourself to be found, first by yourself and then by others who can meet you where you are. You are not broken. You were adaptive, and now you are allowed to soften. If this resonated, share it with someone who learned to survive quietly. Subscribe if you want more explorations into the unseen architecture of the mind. You do not need to be fixed. You need to be whole.